He is a certified athletic trainer, the owner and operator of InStreetClothes.com, and a co-host of the In Street Clothes podcast. We welcome back Jeff Stotts onto Hoopsology. How's it going, Jeff?
I'm doing well. Appreciate you guys having me on, like always.
And I appreciate you coming back. We always like this to pick your brain just about injuries and just about the trends you see within the league, because I think you have a fascinating take and you're very astute to what's going on. So I was going through your tweets and I noticed something very interesting with the Sacramento Kings in particular. That's a team that we've been focused on as of late. They've been really shocking the league. And you said that they really had you really wanted to compliment the hard work of their medical team. And I just wanted to see if you noticed anything that they're doing from a medical perspective compared to the rest of the teams in the NBA that you notice in terms of just keeping their team healthy just because of their success this season.
Well, Sacramento has always had kind of a proactive staff. It goes back several years, almost decades at this point, to Pete Youngman, who Pete is now with the NBA G League or the G League Ignite. So Pete was there for a long time, through all the Western Conference unfortunate follies they had against the Lakers and dated even further back than that. And they laid the groundwork for what it was to be a proactive staff. A lot of their guys have gone on to do other jobs, other places. Ramsey, who was their strength and conditioning coach, is now with Kansas University as running their sports medicine program in terms of sports performance. They've got teams everywhere. Kind of the tree has been spread out pretty well from Pete, and then they kind of kept that going even when Pete was no longer with the organization directly. The people that they brought in, which is a pretty diverse staff, has been proactive and kind of picked up what Pete had kind of set there. And so, part of it is a little bit of luck. I think they'd tell you that too, but even when they've had guys that have gotten injured, those players have been able to play through those injuries. For example, Sabonis is playing through that thumb fracture from earlier in the year. So even though an injury has occurred, it's not costing them games. And for all intents and purposes, hasn't really affected Sabonis' performance either. So they've been pretty fortunate. But I think it's Joel Noland and his staff are just great at what they do, and like I said, proactive, and they have a younger team as well, which is always beneficial in terms of youth is for health purposes always is nice. So it is athletic training month for the month of March, so hat tip to Joel and his crew, as well as all the other athletic trainers around the league, because it's a hard job, but it's come under a lot of scrutiny these last couple of years with things like load management, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit. But they do a great job, and so they're at the top of the league right now in terms of games lost for the season.
Can you predict a team's performance based on their medical staff, like in the beginning of the season? Can you assess, like, hey, this team has a really solid medical staff. They might, not run into just the injury bugs, or that doesn't matter? Like, is that a key in terms of teams winning games, in terms of their veteran, in terms of the experience of a medical staff on a team?
I mean, it definitely helps, right? Like, I can't sit here and say it's going to drastically impact things. What you're trying to do when it comes to any of this stuff is mitigate risk, right? And the more effective your medical team is, the more likely they are to mitigate the risk of something happening. And so I think that's really kind of what we look at. That was the question I kind of asked myself when I started building the database, because all I had heard was how great the Phoenix Suns medical staff was, and they were so proactive, and they were doing all these different things. And you heard veterans that wanted to go play in Phoenix because they were revitalizing careers and things like that. And so I was able to evaluate and look at numbers. And so, the truth is, Phoenix was constantly ranked at the top. But the unfortunate thing is, just because you're not missing that many games to injuries doesn't always equate to success. I mean, Sacramento is the perfect example, right? Like, even though they were routinely one of the top five in terms of healthiest, we're still talking about a 16-year drought now, right, for the playoffs, which looks like it's going to come to an end this year. Happy for the Kings fans, but it's you can predict the possibility and maybe say these are the riskier staffs, but there's also been a ton of turnover in recent seasons and recent years. So when I first got into athletic training and had my eye on the NBA, having conversations with different people, was like, well, you got to get one of those jobs and just kind of wait it out, because those people don't leave. And you've seen a lot more turnover in recent seasons in terms of just, number one, staffs are expanding, but also people are switching teams, or, that's one of the first things that unfortunately gets the axe when new ownership comes in or new general managers, because they're trying to put their impact and their stamp on things. So, if it is not someone they're connected to, they might decide to go an alternative route, because that's scapegoat's kind of a strong word to say, but it's a lot easier than than letting go the players or even the coach in some situations.
So I want to transition to something Paul George said recently. He said that players are too rested for just the intensity of NBA games. Is that actually the case? And is that actually too much rest like a negative in terms of just the, going through the grind of the NBA season? Is it best for just a player to just be playing consistently, or is rest a great strategy? Or does this depends on the player?
Well, it really is. You're trying to find a happy balance. I don't think anybody would sit here and say rest is inherently a bad thing, right? Allowing the body to recuperate. And the league has actually done a lot of things to kind of inherently build in rest. We've seen a drastic reduction in back to back games. We have a lot of these now, uh, baseball series events where the team goes and they play each other back to back. The schedule is drastically friendlier than it was in years past. There's the full week off for the All-Star break. These things are inherent ways to load manage the NBA, right? Rest these players. I think what George is potentially alluding to is the fact that sometimes when you have a big spike in your workload is that can lend itself to potentially a high risk situation where a soft tissue structure could be at risk of a strain or a sprain. So if you have what we're trying to do is, again, like I said, find that balance. And a lot of teams will use the acute to chronic workload ratio, where they're evaluating a player's workload over like a 3 week to 3 month span, and then a little bit shorter, more acute, which can be, again, 3 days to 3 weeks, depending on, again, what kind of window they're looking at, what they're evaluating. And you just don't want those big spikes either way. You don't want to suddenly throw someone into something, and you also don't want to have lulls where then even just a normal return to play would say is technically a big spike. So I kind of get what Paul George is saying, because if you are playing at a high intensity and then you're shut down for a little while and you're playing at high, that can be tough on the body too. So it's finding that balance, finding the natural balance where you're recuperating but also not accumulating any, for lack of better terms, rust.
So, do you find that template that the NBA is doing now with following Major League Baseball, where they kind of do the home and homes, is that a viable solution, you think, in terms of kind of solving kind of the load management issue? Is that a step in the right direction, or is there other steps the league can take in solving this issue that makes everybody happy? I know that's a monumental task. I mean, you're trying to please multiple masters, but I think that is a constant issue that fans bring up.
Yeah, I think I like the idea of the baseball series in a lot of ways, because you can set up shop in terms of a hotel. You're not flying, you're not coming in, that kind of thing. It does, potentially, if you want to rest a guy, you're not leaving those fans in the lurch. There's still the chance that they're going to see them the next night. So you get two kind of cracks at it to see a guy like a Steph Curry. That doesn't always work for a team where you only play them twice, right? So it's, opposite conferences isn't going to work. But it's at least a way to potentially navigate some of that, give some of the power to the players and the fans. The obvious solution is to cut down the number of games. And I know that's not necessarily something anybody wants to do for historical purposes. And I know there's some feedback, obviously money talks and 10 less games and things like that. But I think a 72 game schedule, if you look at it in a way it could spread the schedule out a little bit, would be a little bit more friendly for everybody involved. I know people say, oh, well, that's, less games, but if it increases the likelihood that your LeBrons, your Steph Currys, your Giannis's, your Lucas are going to be playing when you go see them, especially if that's the only time they could travel to your city, that makes a little bit more sense to me. So it'll be interesting to see what steps they make, because I know this is on the forefront of everybody's conversation of what are we going to do moving forward? How's this going to look? What are we going to do? How can we help? Because at the end of the day, we want the players healthy, and load management and rest is not anything new. It's just become so frequently used and in a way that is unfortunate for again, for the fans. The fans suffer, and then again, now you're starting to get a little bit kickback, and it's from the players themselves. So I think it'll be a talking point in the next discussions or around the CBA discussions that they have.
I think the players and fans would be on board with that. I think from a fan perspective, I've heard to start the season at Christmas. And I think with the players, it's certainly a less season, less wear and tear on their bodies. I think, it comes down to the league and the television contracts in terms of, they're going to lose money from that in terms of the value of that kind of bidding war that's happening now for the next TV deal. So I think it's a viable solution. Hopefully, we see that come to fruition soon. Um,
Absolutely, and 10 games is really not that much in the grand
no,
scheme
it's
of
not.
things.
Yeah, totally agree. I want to transition and just get your feedback on what you're seeing in trends in the league so far in terms of injuries. I think last time we spoke, you said you didn't really see any of the irregularities. Are you seeing now? We're pretty much in, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't seen too many players sit out because of COVID. So it seems like that's been mitigated compared to just a couple of years ago. Are you seeing any trends in terms of a spike injuries down that's consistent? Since things are basically back to normal from like a basketball standpoint, you think?
We're definitely seeing a major increase in games lost to COVID and
Wow.
illnesses in general,
Wow.
which is
Wow.
going to drastically help the final numbers. We know last year set a record high for total games lost to injury or illness, and largely to that Omicron variant that hit and
Yeah.
ravaged the league from about mid-December through January. We had we had to have expanded rosters to just make up for that because you had guys that were coming in testing positive and things like that. So uh, that's been the big turnaround. So I think as we're recording this, I think we're at the 87% mark of games played. We're on pace for over 5,000 games lost. Last season, it was 7,000 games. So
Wow.
a pretty big dip down. Now, 5,000, over anything over 5,000 for the most part has historically been pretty high. That being said, those numbers have been, that's kind of where we've been for the last 5 to 6 seasons. We kind of have to throw out the lockout, or not the lockout, the bubble season because of the hiatus. But the years leading up to that, before that, there'd only been one season where there have been over 5,000 since 0506. So now there's been consistently, we're probably looking at that's going to be the bare minimum based on kind of the way we handle injuries at this point. I would love to see that number decline. As far as like trends, the one injury that I'm starting to see a little pop back up a little bit more, which I'm not surprised, I thought it might happen a little earlier, is we're starting to see some stress related injuries
Wow.
prop back up.
Hmm.
And I think that's as we get used to the ramifications of that lockout shortened season, or the bubble season, excuse me, followed by the compressed season, followed by the next season, which still was abnormal. We had the Olympics in the summer and, the truncated off season and things like that. So guys like Cade Cunningham, missed almost the entire season due to stress related injury. That's what limited Anthony Davis and is still limiting him. And those kinds of injuries, I was expecting them to be more of an issue last year, but maybe now we're starting to see some of the long term effects of that alteration of the normal beats of a normal season. So that's kind of what I'm keeping my eye on. Ankle sprains, things like that, seem to be kind of basically where they always are. But the stress injuries are one I'll be tracking for the rest of the season as well as into next year. And the good news is knock on wood, some of the bigger injuries we just haven't seen as many. That we did see a big spike in Achilles tendon tears a couple years back. Hopefully we've seen kind of those numbers go down a little bit too, but that doesn't mean they won't happen. And
Mhm.
just hopefully it's keep our fingers crossed. It's nobody suffers the injury, and definitely nobody noteworthy in terms of a guy like Durant when he did his.
So, what do you see as a solid preventive measure for the league? If I never thought we would see like a pandemic like we did in 2020. If it happens again, from a kind of sports standpoint, what can players do to mitigate the risk of injury if it does happen again? I mean, I can't sit here and say it would never happen again. I mean, just because of what happened in 2020. So, I mean, do you think players have learned from that period of time where if something like that does happen again, they can mitigate the risk for injury in a preparation for that?
Yeah, I definitely think you're going to start. I mean, part of it is just experience, right? We've all been through it. If it were to happen tomorrow, I think we'd all kind of be in a completely different situation than we were than the initial wave because we didn't know what was going on.
Sure.
You know, uh, I think we've all kind of learned how to adapt a little bit. We know how to work from home a little bit more. I think the players now, there are a lot more tools that are available in terms of at home gyms and at home policies and at home things that you can do that teams had to figure out the first time from fresh. Well, now we wouldn't be starting from scratch. We'd be able to handle and mitigate things a little bit better. That being said, it's still problematic in terms of getting to a gym. Not all players have courts in their house, finding the access space, those kinds of things. But I do think between the hiatus, the bubble, and then the following year where there were so many strict protocols in place, if something were to happen again, we'd at least be in a better starting point than we were previously.
And I want to ask just about comparing this era of athlete as well. It seems like this era of athlete, I have heard from just older NBA veterans that they know how to take care of their bodies, compared to just the 90s, the 80s, et cetera. What are you seeing in terms of what are they doing? Like you mentioned the home gyms, like there's any other trends that you're seeing in terms of maybe medical staff, like the evolution from maybe like the 90s to now? Is that just due to just the increase of competition in terms of the athleticism of the athletes that are taking place, or talk about that this evolution, you think?
Yeah, so I think I can both agree the game itself has evolved, right? If you go look at
Yeah,
just the numbers alone this year in terms of scoring,
sure.
I mean, how many 60, 70 point games have we had? Uh,
Yeah,
the use of the 3 point shot, the pace of the game is all drastically different than in the early 2000s and into the 90s. Um, and that's because our athletes have also evolved. We can't sit there and say, well, just the game has evolved. The athlete has also evolved. If you put a guy that looked like Steph Curry and told anybody in 2000 or the 90s he would be the face of the league, just about, they might have laughed at you because his skill set, his size, that was not conducive to being productive. And then you also, on the other end of that, you throw in a guy like Porzingis or Wembanyama in this upcoming draft. These bigger guys, Dirk Nowitzki, even he was the unicorn back then. So the game has evolved, but the demands have changed as well, right? You didn't see Shaq have to guard the three point line.
yeah,
He would have to do that in today's game, which would require more starts and stops on his frame, stretching the court, expanding the court, where he would have more ground to cover. It would not be quite as plodding. Embiid, even a guy who is probably the closest thing we have to Shaq in the game right now, will stretch his game out and shoot the three. So, that changes how the body is loaded in these games. And so I think the game has evolved. I think the game and the athlete has evolved. Now, again, the smarter we get, we have more tools at our disposal. You don't have players smoking as much. I mean, I think I think it would be naive to say not all, no one in the NBA smokes, but I don't think you would see it as regular as it is, or it was, excuse me. Teams now hire dietitians. Meals are catered pre-practice, post-practice, on the plane, as opposed to a guy being sent on his own, especially a young guy who all he knows is, go through the drive-through, grab some fast food. So there's more tools at their disposal. But I also think we're kind of oversaturated the market a little bit too. We're trying to figure out what's noise and what is applicable and it's a lot. It's like trying to drink out of a fire hydrant. You can probably do it if you hold a cup up there and sip, but if you're trying to just take it all in, it's just too much. So trying to read through the noise, find what recovery tools, what modalities, what techniques are useful, what aren't, how can we improve, how's it going to work for a guard versus a center? It's an evolving process. And so, I think you're seeing players invest more in their bodies. I think you're also seeing players potentially play more, which can potentially be part of the problem. You don't have guys just the season ends and they don't go play. They're in the gym consistently, which can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. I think previously you and I talked about, when you're driving your car, you rotate your tires every so many miles.
yeah.
These guys need to rotate their tires, and some of them don't. They never stop and let their body naturally catch back up to the wear and tear that they place on it. So, I think in a lot of ways we're in a much better place. But I still think it's not perfect. And I still think there are things we have to figure out to put our athletes in the best position possible, make sure they're not buying into stuff that isn't necessarily helpful, that, is not just a trend or a fad, is going to be helpful, and really do everything we can. And that's, you're seeing teams buy in. I said it earlier. It used to be the head athletic trainer, maybe an assistant, maybe a PT. And now you look at the staffs around the leagues and it's multiple ATs on staff, a dietitian, a masseuse, a physical therapist, all these different specialties in that wheelhouse of sports medicine, which is great because you're allowing people to focus on their specific area while still allowing plenty of options to come in and treat the athlete.
So we had a reporter that covers the New Orleans Pelicans, and I asked him about Zion Williamson, his injuries, and he basically said it was kind of like a state of flukes, like it wasn't anything like consistent. And now he suffered another injury. I'm just wondering, for such a hyped up prospect, what do you think if you were to predict the future, are you concerned just in terms of the rest of his NBA future and what we're seeing, or is it just kind of, hey, just let it run its course and it's unfair to label him as injury prone, for instance?
It's probably a little bit of both, not to sound a little too wishy-washy there, but, I definitely think when a guy has multiple injuries on the same side over a prolonged period of time, there should be some concern. There needs to be some evaluating. Um, there have been a couple of the injuries that were non-contact, and that's ones you hope you can reduce the risk of happening. You can't stop somebody from coming down on someone's foot. You can't prevent, someone punching you in the face and breaking a bone, or you break your hand, or things like that. Zion's injuries have been unfortunate, and it's you look at the overall cumulative mass of them all, and it is concerning from the standpoint of they're all seem to be kind of on the same side or interlinked and those kinds of things. Um, but there have been plenty of guys. Look at Joel Embiid that have had these labels, these injury prone labels, and just needed time to figure it out, continue developing, and then have a stretch of sustained luck, in terms of, just avoiding that injury bug. Uh, and then the other thing that is unfortunate with Zion is it's the same. What makes him a little bit of a high risk player is the same thing that makes him so valuable. You've never had a guy and his body move like he moves. That's so explosive, that is so fast. Yet, he's not a power forward, but he's not a shooting guard. But if you ask him to potentially lose a lot of weight, does he lose that explosiveness and strength? And if he bulks up too much or tries to do different things in terms of that body mass, does that impact his explosiveness? And so again, it's finding that happy medium for him that where he can be productive and effective on the court, but also mitigate and lower his injury risk. And, I have the utmost respect for the Pelicans medical staff. They are one of the highly rated groups. And, unfortunately, hamstring injuries like the one he's suffering are prone to aggravation. It doesn't matter who you are. They're one of the higher risk injuries of secondary issues and things like that. So, it's tricky. It's a loaded question, and it's one that I hope we find the answer to. And the answer is no. He's not injury prone because he's so fun to watch. Man, he is just
Yeah,
he's
yes.
such a beast, and I would love to see him healthy for sure.
No, me too. I want to ask you what goes into deciding whether a player should get back on the court from coming back from injury. I mean, is it like a tug and pull in terms of that athlete wanting to get back onto the court? Are they working together to assess when they're able to perform at a maximum efficiency while mitigating the risk of them getting hurt? Like, how does that process work in terms of them working together? Because I'm always wondered about that in terms of all the time we hear about, I want to get back on the court, I want to get back on the court, but it's just game after game after game, they're sitting out, and it's just like, what is the kind of that relationship dynamic like between the trainer and then the player and then also the coach as well?
So clinically, a lot of times there's metrics that the players have to hit before they're allowed to return to the court. Whether that's strength needs to be equivalent of the opposite side, or full range of motion with no limitation, no strength, no functional limitation. And those are measurable, quantifiable things that you can present to the player and say, these are the things we need you to get to before you can get back. Um, the unfortunate thing about that is sometimes even that is not perfect. For example, with a hamstring injury, when the strain occurs, that's the tear in the muscle occurs, and then your scar tissue is laid down to fill in those gaps. And your body doesn't do it in a nice, organized fashion. It does it very haphazardly. And so the athlete might report feeling better once that scar tissue is laid down because functionally they probably feel pretty good, but that scar tissue is still really weak. And so they go back out there, it tears, and you press reset on the entire healing process. So that's where you need feedback from the athlete, but you also have to be very careful with what you're doing. And, I think it's the very team dependent, but I think ideally you're having feedback from the players, an understanding that the player and the coach and the athlete training staff and medical staff are all on the same page. This end goal is the same. And then are we hitting these markers and what does that look like? And then you have to do things like evaluate the schedule. Hey, we're playing 4 games in 5 nights. Is it going to be best for us to throw you back in the mix on that? Are we, and we don't have 4 games in 5 nights anymore, but it's a back-to-back on a long road trip, or those kinds of things. And how can we do that? What's that plan going to look like? And then that plan needs to be fluid, because what happens if they report some lingering soreness or some discomfort, those kinds of things. So I think it's very team specific. I think a lot of teams are very protective of what they do. The one thing I will say is it drives me batty when players say, well, if it was the playoffs, I'd be out there, because that means your return to play protocol definitely factors in the weight of the game, which is part of it. I do think there's that part of it, right? In an ideal world, that shouldn't be, right. You should have these set standards, and this is what it is. But if you're going to put an arbitrary number on it, like, okay, I'm 75%. It's a regular season game. I'm not going to play. But if I'm at 75% for a playoff game, maybe I do play. Those kinds of things. And it's so some of it's semantics, some of it's arbitrary numbers, but I think it's a good blend somewhere in between.
Jeff, this has been a fantastic chat. Thank you for joining us. Please let our audience know where they can find you on social media, where they can find your podcast, and any other projects you're working on as well.
Well, it's In Street Clothes on Twitter, and that's the podcast as well. In Street Clothes. So when a player is injured, he's in Street Clothes. That's kind of best way to remember that. We'd love to have the follow and listen to the podcast. It's me and Dr. Brian Sutter, who's on YouTube. Give Brian a follow. He's a great follow for not just the NBA, but all sports. Especially if you'd like that format. He does that so much better than I do. He's a lot prettier than me too. So getting him on there. And then, I do still write for RotoWire as well. So you can, if you're a fantasy baseball or fantasy football player, check out RotoWire, because you'll find me writing injury write-ups for that side as well.
Awesome. Jeff, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.